Is Rick Warren fine? Ever since he suffered the most heartbreaking tragedy of his life on April 5, 2013, he hasn't been the same. And now, it looks like things might get worse for him. This is the story of how one family's nightmare became a crusade, and how even the strongest faith can't protect you from the weight of grief that never really goes away. This is the thing most people don't understand about Rick Warren. Before his never-ending grief broke him, the world had already seen him break on national television. Rick had already learned what it felt like to be torn apart in public. Back in 2006, when Saddleback was exploding in size, Rick's name became a lightning rod. His growth made him famous, but it also made him a target. Rick came about the purpose-drive growth model, which many churches didn't agree with, but even he could not have predicted what came next. Congregations across America split because they tried to follow his strategies. Churches dividing, members being pushed out, and friendships ending in parking lot arguments over worship styles and seating arrangements. Rick hated that. He begged pastors not to force anything, not to expel people, not to treat growth like war. But the damage happened anyway. And every time a church tore itself apart using his playbook, Rick felt responsible. Imagine carrying that, knowing something you created helped thousands thrive and ripped hundreds apart. And then he got worse. In 2008, Rick stepped into a storm he never saw coming. After winning his election, Barack Obama asked him to deliver the inaugural prayer. It should have been an honor. Instead, it became a national scandal. People dug up a letter he'd written to his own congregation, his personal belief that marriage, biblically, was between one man and one woman. And the fallout wasn't pretty. Rick Warren went from best-selling pastor to a man accused of hate speech, headlines, protests, calls for his removal from the inauguration. The irony? 6 months earlier, he'd been hugging HIV patients, working with gay men and women in his church's AIDS ministry, telling reporters he had real friendships in the LGBTQ community. But none of that mattered. America wanted a villain. Obama defended him, said disagreement wasn't hatred, said Rick had welcomed him at Saddleback even when they clashed on issues. But the backlash burned anyway. And the strangest part? While one side demanded he apologize, the other side, many fellow evangelicals, began attacking him for the opposite reason. They said he wasn't harsh enough, not militant enough, not angry enough. Rick looked at them and wondered how fighting people could possibly bring them closer to Jesus. No matter what he said, he lost someone. No matter what he did, someone called him a coward. It didn't end there. New accusations flooded in. In 2009 and again in 2012, evangelical pastors criticized Rick for sitting down with Muslims, sharing meals with imams, and attending interfaith conferences about peace, poverty, and global suffering. He talked about being a friend to all because Jesus was. But that simple idea of friendship set off another wave of outrage. Compromise, deception, betrayal. They threw the words at him like stones. Every time Rick tried to build a bridge, someone accused him of burning one. However, he was used to controversy, used to criticism, used to waking up and discovering strangers had decided what kind of man he was. But nothing, none of it, prepared him for the pain that came next. Matthew Warren was 7 when the diagnosis came. Clinical depression, the doctors said, and Rick and Kay Warren couldn't quite wrap their minds around it. How does a child, barely old enough to tie his own shoes, carry that kind of darkness? But they saw it. The signs were there from the beginning, from when Matthew was just a toddler. Something wasn't right. Something in the wiring of his beautiful, brilliant mind that made the world feel sharper, crueler, heavier than it should. He was the kind of kid who could walk into a room and immediately find the person who was suffering. Maybe because he recognized the pain in others, the same pain that lived inside him every single day. Friends remember Matthew making a beeline toward whoever looked uncomfortable at parties, whoever seemed lost in a crowd. He had this gift, this radar for human hurt. The irony cuts deep, doesn't it? The boy who could sense everyone else's darkness was drowning on his own. Rick Warren would later describe his son as incredibly kind, gentle, compassionate. A young man with a brilliant intellect and a sweet spirit that brought comfort to so many people. But that's the public face, the one Matthew showed the world. Behind closed doors, the Warren family was living a different reality. Doctor appointments that never ended, medications that promised relief but delivered nothing, therapy sessions that felt like throwing stones into an ocean. Year after year, watching their son struggle with deep depressions that swallowed him whole, panic attacks that came out of nowhere, mood swings that turned his personality inside out. They tried everything. America's best doctors, Rick said, the most advanced treatments, counselors, prayers from thousands of people around the world who didn't even know Matthew's name. The Warrens kept his illness quiet, not out of shame, but because it was his story to tell, his dignity to protect. How do you explain to your megachurch congregation, to the millions who read your books, that your own son is asking you why he can't just die? Because that's what Matthew asked his father. When he was 17 years old, sitting across from Rick, the boy looked at him and said something that would haunt the pastor for the rest of his life. He told his dad it was obvious, painfully obvious, that he wasn't going to be healed. They'd been to the best doctors in the nation. He'd taken the best medicine. They'd tried everything anyone could think of, and nothing worked. So Matthew asked his father the question that no parent should ever have to hear. Why can't I just die and go to heaven? Rick told him he couldn't give up, that as a father, he had to believe there might be an answer out there somewhere, some treatment they hadn't tried yet, some breakthrough just around the corner. Matthew made it another 10 years after that conversation. 10 years of trying, of hoping, of waking up every morning with that same relentless pain wrapped around his brain like barbed wire. But here's what Rick Warren knew in his gut, even if he couldn't say it out loud. He knew something bad was coming. Call it intuition, call it a father's fear, call it whatever you want. He knew that someday, maybe soon, Matthew's pain would become too much to bear, and that knowledge sat in his chest like a stone, heavy and cold, every single day. On April 5th, the Warrens had a fun evening together. That's what makes it so devastating. They spent time as a family, laughing, talking, and being together. Everything seemed fine. Matthew seemed fine. But depression is a liar. It tells you there's no way out, no relief, no hope. And in what Rick would later call a momentary wave of despair, Matthew went home to his place in Mission Viejo. Sometime around 10 a.m. that Friday morning, he made a decision that would shatter his family into pieces. He shot himself. The call came in the afternoon. Matthew had been found dead in his home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The gun had its serial number scratched off, an unregistered weapon he'd bought illegally over the internet. In California, where background checks are mandatory, where gun registration is the law, Matthew had found a way around all of it. Later, Rick would tweet about the person who sold his son that gun, would say he forgave them, would quote Matthew 6:15 about forgiving others so that God will forgive you. But on that Friday, there was no forgiveness, no theology, no purpose. Just a father who had to identify his son's body. Within 30 minutes of getting the news, Rick and Kay's small group arrived. They didn't call, text, or wait for permission. They just showed up on that sidewalk, wrapped their arms around the Warrens, and stood there. The deeper the pain, Rick would say later, the fewer words you need. That night, his small group slept on couches, in the kitchen, wherever they could find space in the Warren home. They said, "We're not leaving you alone." And they didn't. The next day, Rick wrote to his congregation at Saddleback Church. After 33 years of being their pastor, of standing with them at gravesides, of holding their hands through every crisis imaginable, he told them the truth. "No words can express the anguished grief we feel right now," he wrote. "Our youngest son, Matthew, age 27 and a lifelong member of Saddleback, died today." He described Matthew's kindness, his compassion, and his brilliant mind. But he also said what needed to be said. That despite America's best doctors, best medications, best prayers, The torture of mental illness never subsided. The media exploded. Rick Warren, the purpose-driven pastor, had lost his son to suicide. The irony was too much for some people to resist. How could the man who helped millions find meaning in their lives not save his own child? The criticism came fast and cruelly. Some questioned his faith. Others suggested this was God's judgment. Rick ignored most of it, but the weight of public grief is different from private mourning. Everyone wanted a piece of his pain, wanted to understand it, analyze it, use it to prove whatever point they needed to prove. But Rick had other concerns, like planning a funeral that couldn't happen. There was no building in Orange County large enough to hold all the people who wanted to come. So the Warrens made a decision. A private memorial, just family. They asked people to honor Matthew's memory by donating to the Matthew Warren Fund for mental health instead. The checks started arriving by the thousands. Rick didn't preach for 4 months, 16 weeks of intentional silence. He stepped away from the pulpit at Saddleback, let other pastors fill in, and spent his days alone with Kay and God. When you spend that much time in serious conversation with the Almighty, Rick said, it changes you. And it did. When he finally returned in late July, standing before his congregation for the first time since Matthew's death, Rick was different. He felt people's pain more deeply now. He teared up easily. He didn't just sympathize anymore. He empathized, because now he knew what it felt like to bury your child. The sermon that day was about getting through what you're going through. The topic had been chosen weeks before Matthew's suicide, a cosmic coincidence that felt almost cruel. Rick talked about grief as God's gift, the way we transition through loss. He cried on stage. Kay stood beside him and wiped tears from his cheek. She told the congregation that Matthew's body was broken, that the gun had broken it, but that he'd be raised in glory. She spoke about missing him, about the broken heart she'd carry until Jesus came for her. And she said something that stopped people cold. It's okay, she said, to walk through life with tears in your eyes and a smile on your face at the same time. That sermon launched something bigger. A mental health initiative at Saddleback Church, conferences, workshops, support groups. Rick partnered with the Catholic Diocese of Orange, with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, with psychiatrists and counselors and anyone who would listen. He started asking the question that needed to be asked. There's no shame when your heart fails, no shame when your kidneys stop working. So why do we feel shame when our brains break down? He talked about Matthew openly now, called him brave, said Matthew was one of the bravest people he'd ever met because he kept going for 10 more years after asking why he couldn't just die. Rick read letters from people Matthew had brought to faith in Christ, thousands of letters. He wrote in his journal that in God's garden of grace, even broken trees bear fruit. It became his mantra, his way of making sense of the senseless. Matthew's life had meaning even in its brokenness, maybe especially in its brokenness. And Rick forgave. Not just the gun seller, but life itself. He never questioned his faith in God, he said on CNN months later. He questioned God's plan. There's a difference. He knew God was good. But not everything that happens is God's will, he explained. God allows things because we live in a world of free choices. If Matthew chose to take his own life, Rick couldn't blame God for that. He had to accept it, had to find a way to live with it, and had to figure out how to keep breathing when every instinct said to stop. Rick called Matthew brave. He said it again and again in interviews, in sermons, in quiet conversations with friends. Brave for lasting 27 years. Brave for getting up every morning despite the relentless pain. Brave for trying one more medication, one more therapy session, one more day when everything in him screamed to quit. And maybe Rick was right. Maybe endurance in the face of that kind of suffering is the truest form of courage there is. But here's what people didn't see. Rick never really moved past it. How could he? You don't move past losing a child. You don't get over it. You get through it, maybe. You learn to carry it. But it's always there, that grief, sitting in your chest like a second heart. Rick told people he cried every single day after Matthew died. Every single day. And he didn't see that as weakness. He saw it as love. Mental health advocacy became his mission. Depression became part of his preaching, woven into sermons and devotionals and interviews. He talked about it in 2024, still working with California's Catholic bishops on a pastoral letter called Hope and Healing. He said it was a watershed moment, a new standard for mental health ministries around the world. Your chemistry is not your character, Rick preached. Your illness is not your identity. He said the words like an incantation, like if he repeated them enough times, they might heal someone else's son, someone else's daughter. In 2025, Rick was still at it, still preaching, still traveling the world, speaking at the World Evangelical Alliance in Seoul, South Korea, teaching at Saddleback, recording his daily hope devotionals. He talked about faith and purpose and finding meaning in suffering. He set up foundations for mental health, for AIDS patients, for finishing the Great Commission. He and Kay lived on 9% of their income and gave away 91%. They have 5 grandchildren now. Life continued. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between sermons and conferences and world travel, Rick Warren was still that father on a sidewalk in Mission Viejo. Still the man who couldn't save his son. Still carrying that conversation from when Matthew was 17. That question about why he couldn't just die. The pain hadn't gone away. It had just become part of who he was. And here's the heartbreaking news that most people don't talk about. Rick Warren is still grieving. Years later, more than a decade later, the loss hasn't diminished. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Some wounds just become scars you learn to live with. Rick found strength to be there for other people, to hold their hands at gravesides, to tell them about God's garden of grace where even broken trees bear fruit. But his tree is still broken. It always will be. He preaches about hope, but carries despair. He talks about God's goodness while questioning God's plan. He helps millions find their purpose while wondering if he could have done more to save Matthew. It's the terrible paradox of pastoral ministry. You give and give and give until there's nothing left, and then you give some more. Because people need you. Because the work matters. Because stopping would mean admitting that maybe, just maybe, there's no purpose in some kinds of pain. Rick Warren's faith didn't break. That's what he tells people. That's what he believes. He never questioned God's existence, never doubted heaven, never stopped believing in the resurrection. Matthew's body was broken, but he's in glory now. Rick knows it in his bones. He'll see his son again someday, whole and healed and free from the torment that plagued him for 27 years. That belief is what keeps Rick going. It has to be. Because without it, Matthew's death is just senseless tragedy, random suffering in an indifferent universe. But the question lingers. Is Rick Warren really fine? He says he's different now, changed, more empathetic. He feels people's pain in a way he never did before Matthew's death. He tears up easily. He connects with the broken and hurting because he is broken and hurting. The polished megachurch pastor who wrote best-selling books has been replaced by something rawer, more human. Maybe that's growth. Maybe that's grace. Or maybe it's just what happens when the worst thing imaginable becomes your reality. Rick continues his work, continues preaching to thousands every week, continues traveling the world spreading the gospel, continues building his empire of churches and foundations and initiatives. But every Monday morning, he admits, he wakes up with what he calls post-message syndrome, wondering if someone else could do a better job, wondering if he's smart enough, strong enough, faithful enough to lead a church of tens of thousands. The doubt creeps in, the exhaustion, the weight of carrying everyone else's burdens while barely managing his own. He tells people that God never allows more on you than he puts in you to bear it, that people should help each other carry each other's burdens. But what happens when your burden becomes too heavy to carry? What happens when faith and medicine and prayer and everything else you try still isn't enough? Rick doesn't have those answers. Nobody does. All he has is the choice to keep going or to stop. And he chooses to keep going. But the cracks show. In interviews where he chokes up mid-sentence, in sermons where he has to pause and collect himself, in tweets that reveal more pain than comfort. Kay stands beside him, wiping his tears, carrying her own broken heart. They're not the same people they were before April 5th, 2013. How could they be? The story doesn't have a neat ending. There's no redemption arc where everything makes sense. No moment where Rick suddenly finds peace and the pain evaporates. Just a man who lost his son, who questions God's plan while clinging to God's goodness, who preaches hope while living with heartbreak. Just a father who forgave the person who sold his son a gun, because forgiveness is what you're supposed to do, even when it feels impossible. Is Rick Warren fine?